A warm welcome to this dialogue and book launch of the Routledge Handbook of Urban Resilience, which is jointly hosted by the Bartlett Development Planning Unit and the Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality, the KNOW program. My name is Julie Vesely. I'm a research fellow in the KNOW program at the DPU, and I have the pleasure of chairing the next hour. Before we start and I introduce our speakers and discussant, just to point you, I think, to the usual housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded, so you can find it later online, but I obviously encourage everyone to stay, to contribute to the discussion in the second half of this hour. You can add your questions and comments as we go into the Q&A tab. And if you don't mind to also add your affiliation, to add your background, so we get a bit of an idea of where your question is coming from. I know that some of the chapter authors of the handbook are joining us today as well, so I think I'd especially encourage you to share any thoughts or comments on the discussion today from the perspective of your research. So the theme of today's dialogue is debating resilience, complexity, contradictions, and optimism. And the Routledge Handbook is really a great reference manual to get a synoptic overview of the state of the art, of the trajectory of resilience in the urban realm. I think that wherever one situates herself in the resilience debates in theory and practice, that really events like the one today, where we are joined by 160 people across the globe, and where we work and study resilience from very different angles, those events really give a glimpse of the profound attraction of the concept. And as the handbook editors, who are Michael Boragidi, Adriana Allen, John Twigg, and Christina Wamsler put more eloquently, and I quote, "Urban resilience epitomizes how ideas and practices might travel, settle, construct, or colonize new domains of thinking and practice. In the process, the concept has become translated and embedded in new contexts, forging new meanings, relations, practices, and subjectivities." This links then to the provocation which Alan Lavelle put into the foreword, and which was quoted on the website with the invitation to today's event. If the concept of resilience were to disappear from use and discussion tomorrow, how much would change and where would it change in terms of advance on the problems that resilience is used to announce and searches to help comprehend and resolve? So with this, I'm really delighted to announce our speakers and discussant for today. First, we're going to hear from Professor John Twigg, who is a former senior researcher at the Overseas Development Institute and an honorary professor at the Department of Civil, Environmental and Geomatic Engineering at UCL. He's one of the co-editors of the Handbook of Routledge, the Routledge Handbook of Urban Resilience, and will share with us the ideas behind the publication and its way of framing and advancing discussions on urban resilience. We'll hear from Professor Alan Lavelle, who is a founding member of the Network of Social Studies in the Prevention of Disasters in Latin America, LARED, and who has been working at the Latin American Social Sciences Institute, Flaxo. Alan is leading the work on resilience in the Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality program, where he is coordinating research in Lima and Barranquilla and San Jose on the relations between disaster risk management and urban equality. And so his talk today will precisely focus on exploring those links. And the final speaker will be Mark Pelling, who's Professor of Geography and one of the directors of King's College London Centre for Integrated Research on Risk and Resilience. He's also the challenge lead on the Resilience to Environmental Shocks and Change portfolio for the UK's Global Challenges Research Fund, the GCRF, and the coordinating lead author for the IPCC. So in light of this, his presentation will be looking back and looking forward on the debates of cities and resilience and wider research agendas. I'm really sorry to say that Professor Adriana Allen, who was announced as speaker as well, could not join us today, but this is certainly not the last talk on urban resilience, so I really hope that we can welcome her to the next one. We've asked each speaker to present for about 8 minutes, and after that, Cassidy Johnson, who's professor at the DPU and also a co-investigator on the KNOW program, will share some reflections and discussion points, which means we have about 20 to 30 minutes then for the Q&A afterwards. And finally, before we get going, I really want to take this opportunity also to thank Alex McFarlane and David Heyman for their work behind this kind of virtual curtain on everything that relates to communications and technical support. So thank you everyone for joining us today. It's really great, an honor to have you and to finally host this event, which I think initially was planned for mid-March. And I'm going to hand over to John to kick off the discussions on the complexity, contradictions, and optimism of urban resilience.
Thank you. I'm going to give a kind of very brief introduction to how this project came about, and leave it to my fellow speakers to talk about what's in the book and what it really presents. The origins of this book go back to 2014, actually, when I was approached by Andrew Mould, who's an editor at Routledge responsible for urban and environmental studies, about the idea of doing a handbook. It was just an idea at that stage. It would be a companion on current debates, controversies and questions. And I said yes, but then I kind of dragged my feet a bit because other things got in the way, as they usually do in these kind of projects. And we didn't make much progress for a while until in 2017, the publisher pushed things forward a bit by getting in touch with Michael Buriidi at Ball State University, Indiana, who's a specialist on urban risk and resilience. And at the same time, Adriana and Christina Vansler were part of the team as well. And that sort of galvanized the project. And we got moving at that point and started reaching out through our networks to identify potential authors and potential themes, looking as widely as we possibly could. And then we went through the process, obviously, of receiving all the various abstracts, selecting the papers and trying to identify and, if possible, fill some of the gaps. What you'll see if you've actually seen the book or even started to read it are a huge number of chapters, actually. There's, I think, 67 authors in the publication from different parts of the world, a wide variety of academic and professional disciplines. Their contributions are embodied in more than 30 chapters. But the book itself, and they're very diverse in terms of what they cover. The book itself is framed in 4 parts. There's a conceptual section, a section on urban systems under stress, which is a kind of review of the state of play. Discussions of the very many different dimensions of resilience. And that's quite important in that resilience is such a sort of elastic and even elusive concept sometimes that it's quite hard to pin down. It can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. And the 4th theme is about resilience building in practice. So the idea was, in this synopsis, if you can call it that, is that we're encompassing the whole range, certainly a range of geographies, but also a range of approaches, from the very conceptual to the very, very practical and grounded, if you like. And then there are introductions and conclusions, obviously. We aimed to be as wide-ranging as we possibly could, reflecting the diversity in the field. But I mean, trying to capture this is quite difficult because we can never get comprehensive coverage. We're only going to get, in a sense, a series of snapshots, and inevitably there was a little bit of randomness in the way that the final product turned out. But I think anyone who's looked at the book will find that there are surprisingly interesting chapters on subjects which one had never thought of. There's a lot of the unexpected in it. I, for one, was captivated by a chapter on psychological benefits of roof gardens, which I never thought I'd be thinking about in a resilience context. So to wrap up, I suppose the question is, where do we go with this book and what can we do with it? I mean, it's obviously going to be useful for teaching. I hope it will be read by practitioners, because there are a lot of examples of practice. And by practitioners, I mean everyone from kind of high-level policymakers down to city-level officials and non-governmental and civil society organizations as well. There is an awful lot in it, I have to say. I'm one of the few people who's probably read it all, and I need to read it again to remind myself of the diversity of insights and information that it contains. And I hope this webinar will be a bit of an introduction to that, and a chance to encourage those of you who are listening and taking part to really engage with the book and the ideas that it presents. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for giving us a bit of a background and also an overview of the different parts and the diversity of the book. We go next to Alan Lavelle.
Yeah, seems to say that I can't start the video because the host has stopped it. Can you hear me?
Yes, and you should be able to start it now.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and a very good morning from good morning from San Jose, Costa Rica. Firstly, obviously, I'd like to very much thank the editors, the authors, those that made this book possible, and thank them for the kind invitation to write the prologue to the book, which is an amazing collection, as John has just said, a diverse collection, moving from concept through to practice, etc., on a topic which obviously has come onto the scene very quickly and is still in a process of debate, discussion, dissension. And I must admit that, as I said to Adriana when she asked me to write the prologue, I come from a background where I objected to coping capacities in the 60s. I objected to survival strategies, and I did object to resilience in the way it has been used. But at the same time, as time goes by and things get more and more processed when it comes to a more equanimous understanding of what it's all about. So I'm not going to get into the debate on where we are with concept. I'm going to go back to a very simple, basic interpretation of what I understood as resilience, having read Hollings and child psychologists and engineers, which is basically bouncing back, getting back in order after a shock has occurred. And I'm not going to get into the transformational elements, etc., which obviously flow from the ability to be resilient, etc., but not necessarily our resilience as such. And so, given the time, I won't go too far on any of those points. Basically, I have just 3 points which can be divided into a few parts in some cases. One is that obviously resilience, and here I'm talking as a central theme of urban risk and urban resilience and inequality, which is basically the center for the No study and where we've been looking at the resilience element. The first point is that resilience obviously is in function of, related to, directly binomially related to the whole idea of risk, and risk as actualized risk in shock or disaster. So they're intimately related as notions, ideas, and in the flow of thought about concept and practice. A second point, which is basically relates to the central topic of this short intervention, is that we've come to accept, and I think COVID has done amongst many things, many favors, which hopefully we can take up of it in the future. COVID-19 has very clearly illustrated what we've been saying for a long time in many parts, that risk is related to inequality. And the different expressions of inequality, as has been put forward in the No project in terms of welfare, access, service provision, recognition, voice and participation. And few of us would not accept that most risk, disaster risk as we call it, is associated in fact with inequality and the offshoots from that in terms of poverty, exclusion, marginalization, etc. And consequently, we have to accept that resilience in its existence or not would also be intimately related to inequality. If risk and resilience are related, then obviously inequality comes up as a central factor in understanding or looking at both. The third one is that some time ago, at the end of the 90s, I wrote a thing on urban risk, which I didn't follow up on very much, but as I look at it over time, it still strikes me to have something relevant, where I suggested that urban risk is in fact related to urban processes. That means to say you can have risk in cities, which isn't necessarily urban risk, because urban risk must relate to those processes which urban studies identify as being part of the process by which cities are constructed. And consequently, I also derive the opinion that resilience then can and should be related to those, both in terms of negative and positive elements. Those things that I identified, and I'm not saying they're the only ones, or even maybe the most significant today, in a world where we recognize that risk has got so much more complex over the last 10 years or since the financial crisis, where we have all of these discussions on systemic, emergent risk, conventional, idiosyncratic risk, etc., with a multitude of hazards. And the whole notion of risk itself is turning to be far more complex than it was some time ago. The things that I identified there, which I would put forward as a way of getting into the study of risk and resilience, were first the whole notion of socio-spatial segregation in cities, which is again related to inequality, to exclusion, to marginalization, to poverty, and to a series of other things, and remits us in socio-spatial segregation to lack of access to services, to voice, to participation, etc. A second one is the whole notion of centralization, concentration, densification, which typifies cities, and risk is born in that process, and in the same way access to or non-access to resilient societies also can be seen related to it. A third one, which has now assumed far more importance with the notion of systemic risk, is the whole idea of the interrelationship of the parts of a city, the interconnectivity, and the lack of redundancy many times in terms of the offer of services or the infrastructure to provide services. And this has both an intra-urban and an inter-urban component that can be analysed, and within the framework of systemic risk study through Sendai, the Global Assessment Report is seen to be important. A fourth one, and I'm going through these very quickly, is the whole idea of nature-human relationships. Could be expressed through environmental degradation or any other form of talking about common services, etc., etc. And where obviously risk is born in the type of relationship that ensues, and the ability and the possibility for resilience is also born in that relationship. And the last one is the whole notion of governance, inadequate governance at a city level, which breeds and is a driver, like many of the others, of risk conditions in the city, but is also the harbinger of non-resilience or the developer of resilience as it comes along. So basically, I will finish with that, which I think keeps me within the 8 minutes, which is more a suggestive approach to things, trying to open up some questions. And in the end, what I was suggesting in my own mind was if one were to put on a double entry chart on the vertical axis, these 5 elements of urban process which lead to both of these conditions, and on the top axis the whole notion of the different expressions of inequality, from service access to access to life satisfiers, through to participation and recognition, then we could start to work with a matrix and start to examine different aspects of what is related to what we call urban risk. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Alan, for that thought-provoking 8 minutes. I think there's a lot to unpack here. So just to remind everyone that please don't hold back with your questions and put them into the Q&A as we go along. Mark?
Hi, I can't show myself, I'm afraid. The video function's been switched off. Maybe it will become switched on in a little while, but let me share my screen.
You should be able to turn on your video now, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. And hopefully you can see the slides as well. Sorry to bore you with slides after the previous speakers avoided such a trap. But really all I want to do is to reflect on 3 things. And in some way, this is, I suppose, a challenge to the authors and a recognition of the time it takes to think about, to draw together authors and to write a book. And I was asked to think about the ways in which the urban resilience field might be changing, and funding interests and others. And certainly it feels to me as though there's an inflection point at the moment in at least 3 ways. So the challenge, if you like, is to reflect on how far the Routledge Handbook has been able to look into these emergent properties of the way we think about urban resilience and talk to them. So the three ways in which I want to get into this very briefly are to think through the way in which we imagine what urban resilience might be, through the geography of funded projects, the ways in which this is very much a UK perspective, the way in which funding might inadvertently close or open certain predominant ways of experiencing and thinking about resilience from an academic community perspective, to look then at some of the empirical evolutions, if you like, the ways in which the city itself or urban settlements are changing, and wondering how far the literature on resilience is keeping pace with that. And then finally, to look at some of the methodological, indeed even ethical contexts within which we undertake our work. So the first of these is drawing from some data by the Global Challenges Research Fund. This is just looking back. Really the most important graphs here, and this is mainly why I wanted to use my slides and share them with you, those on the left. So you can look here and see those by intensity of funded project. The dark blue colors indicate darkest blue are basically 30 projects funded in that country on sustainable cities. Underneath it is a graphic that attempts to look at the projected concentration of urban land use going forward. So it's an interesting way of looking at where research has landed, funded by the UK's Global Challenges Research Fund, and thinking about how far that maps onto emerging areas of urbanization. I also searched by city work and work on resilience, disaster shocks and change, and then combined that also with work on poverty and livelihoods. So you can see that on the right-hand side. I don't think it matters too much to look at the detail, but certainly to me, I'd be interested in what you draw from the funded work maps. But to me, it shows quite clearly that there's a real preponderance of research informed by linguistic ties, colonial ties, larger urbanized societies, and perhaps easier to reach countries in terms of not just flight paths and so on, but also accessing urban places. So examples being South Africa, Kenya, India. And that at one side is a positive. These are important urban and urbanizing societies, but it means an awful lot of the urban world is marginal to that imaginary and to the imaginary we gain through that particular example of funded research. And even more so if one looks at the graphic at the bottom left, which really highlights anticipated rapid urban growth across sub-Saharan Africa, which we know, of course, and highlighting also the importance of smaller settlements as the place where there will be rapid change, which aligns itself very often to rapid environmental change as well. So I want to pick up some of that in the next comments, but it's important to remind ourselves, I think, that our experience by and large is still grounded in a very narrow view of what the urban is. To add to that narrow view, happy to be challenged on that, of course, is a sense that we inherit a set of empirical contexts that are difficult to break free of. And Alan indicated one of these, I think, around COVID, and the sense that we have tended, I think, over the last few years to focus a lens around resilience, which can mean many things. But one of the things I think policymakers are very keen for it to mean is a footloose, adaptive, flexible approach to infrastructure and policy making, something that suggests win-win and projects dynamism. And the seduction of those words and that approach to policy has in part, arguably, allowed a shift away from more fundamental efforts to reduce vulnerability to confront gaps in basic services, land rights, access to education, healthcare, community solidarity, representative politics, and so on. Things that are well known, well documented, but I think certainly have not been at the forefront of cutting edge research, and probably have been downgraded to quite mundane research over the last 5 years or so. And I think COVID has really highlighted the importance of processes that create vulnerability in context of risk in cities, and that we need to approach those processes again. And connected to that, a sense, I think, looking forward, indeed, that the processes that lead to the creation of vulnerability are different in scale, if not drivers, than they may have been a decade or so ago. And I'm thinking here really about the rapidly increasing connectivity between not just urban areas, but urban, rural, not just formal connections of trade, but also informal remittances, connections through ideas as well. And a sense that might be summarized, if you like, that no cities will be resilient until all cities are resilient. And that makes us, I think, be quite challenged, particularly those of us who have experience working at community level and asking ourselves what relevance, what sorts of exposures, what policy purchase for impactful research we have at the community level if we feel the drivers of risk received locally are increasingly connected to these global flows. Should we be focusing more on things like supply chains, the economics of foreign direct investment, in order to enhance local resilience? I've shown this image just to remind us of the complexity of the beast we're looking at. This is a piece from the IPCC 1.5, which simply looks at the points of co-benefit between mitigation and adaptation. And it, as you can see, is a classically complicated IPCC diagram. And the point to get from this, I think, is not just complexity, but that in that complexity is a drift towards a search for co-benefits rather than alternatives to development. Co-benefits, I think, disguise the fact that development itself is often unjust and institutionally so, so that achieving co-benefits at a technical level perhaps doesn't address and respond to what might have been described as alternative developments. Just finally, to wrap up some of these points and reflect on the sort of the larger methodological ethical questions, particularly those of us who are interested in research that has an action element to it. We have an ongoing responsibility and challenge to bring together different knowledges, the experiential of local actors, the technical of policy actors, and the instrumental perhaps of political actors. How we merge, bring together, represent those knowledges is at the heart, I think, of the contemporary challenge, the more so because of the systemic nature of risk. I don't have any answers to these, but I think the book itself highlights some of these challenges. There's a challenge to us around how we act in solidarity towards what we recognize increasingly as the very intersectional set of local actors, the multiplicity of identities, the shifting identities and power dynamics locally. How does one intervene in that? What are the ethical implications for outsiders, good and bad, but particularly if, as I indicated earlier, we have an interest not just in understanding, facilitating progressive action thinking, talking at the local level, but raising that against the structural and systemic issues that are increasingly powerful in shaping the local. In cities, as we know, are multi-level systems, and the book goes into depth in this. But to me, it's just to say this provides a particular level of challenge that many other empirical sites perhaps don't have to contend with. Not just that they're multi-level, but they're multiple, overlapping, often hidden, implicit, informal. many of the usual access points and research are missing, particularly if, as I said earlier, we're interested in working in places that are emerging around risk, not just the systemic, but places where there are no informal organized groups, where local government is absent, but where growth is rapid. Researchers very often work through established relationships built up over time through NGO relations, through perhaps students who've gone on to work in policy. How can we authentically reach into places where those gaps exist? I've mentioned the COVID-19 point. And lastly, perhaps more positively, from my own experience of working in several cities at the moment through COVID, has really highlighted the importance of local research colleagues who are able to collect data, to engage with policymakers far more effectively than I can through Zoom. And I think I hope that has forced some rethinking of the power relations between local researchers and those closer to the sources of funding, and that some of that will persist. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm going to hand over straight to Cassidy to give some discussion and feedback provocations from your 3 presentations before we go to the Q&A.
Great. Oh, good. The video is working. So just a big thank you to all our speakers today. I think that you've all given quite different perspectives on what is a complex issue. And I think that from what John raised, I mean, talking about even the different sections of the book, the complexity of trying to encompass what is a multifaceted and wide-ranging into one book, which is arguably a large book, shows the kind of the breadth of work on resilience. And I think from Alan, he also in his 5 points brings out, you know, that resilience has a strong relationship to urban risk, and that there are many different ways that we can understand resilience between, you know, centralization, concentration, systemic risk, the nature-human relationships, but that those, and he very much ties the notion of resilience to risk. And that's something maybe we can question a bit more later. And I think Mark's approach talks about the research, and I think quite interestingly, looking at, you know, where research is happening through the UK research councils, and how that might maybe not map onto what we see as the urban growth in the future. But then also questioning, you know, what sort of as the history of UK development, which countries do we have associations with and ties with? And I really like that he brought out this relationship to local researchers in the end, because I think that, you know, COVID has certainly changed the way we have been doing research, and even things like this webinar, which would have been something that we were supposed to hold last March in person and only really for people who are in London, is all of a sudden available to everybody across the world. And this is really changing the way that we're doing research. And I think that that's really very exciting, and has really big potential for looking at not only resilience, but different issues across the country. And I just wanted to say one, maybe make one sort of statement that's really, that I think really epitomizes the work on urban resilience. that has been exposed through the COVID-19 and what's happened in India with the migrants and people having to leave at the beginning of this lockdown in Indian cities. And I think it really exposes that inability of people to even have enough food to survive on for a few weeks. And this, it really talks about, you know, what are the resilience of our systems and of people to be able to respond to those kind of events. And so I think that you know, we see those from those kind of disaster events, and COVID has brought that. So I'd like to open up to some questions from that, and we have a few here. And so I'll bring two questions now. And John and Mark and Alan, you're also welcome to look at the other questions in the chat and come for that. But so we have from Fred Kruger, who says, Alan, could you please elaborate on how governance is a driver of non-resilience in cities? Just some details and examples, please. And Caroline Moser, can you elaborate on the concept of co-benefits as against co-production? And I think John, you could probably answer one of those questions also. So maybe to Alan first.
Yeah, maybe the easiest way of answering Fred's question is the reverse of, or inverse of, what Mark put up at the end in terms of you know, understanding different perspectives on things and co-production of knowledge, etc. And therefore, if one looks at a lot of the governance schemes around risk, apart from the fact that many are still very well behind the conceptual frameworks which are being put forward, and I say that guardedly, I mean that we have not moved into a world of risk reduction and risk control, risk prospection, etc. We are still very much in a preparedness and response mode, and COVID showed that very, very clearly in many, many countries, etc. And so I think if one does the reverse of what Mark put forward, then, and so other things like, we're still in a siloed world. You know, we're still asking questions about one thing which are intimately related to another, and then they're being dealt with as separate things. There's a question come up on conflict in cities, which is clearly related to a whole series of other things, but only if we have holistic and more integral approaches to planning, investment criteria, etc., will we get where we need to get. And so, not to prolong it more because there isn't that much time, I think, you know, Mark put forward a series of very important points, and these are all coming up in the debate of systemic risk. In fact, there's a close relationship, and I've got the feeling that resilience is going to assume even more importance in the framework of the discussion of systemic risk, particularly when it's considered at a global level, accepting that systemic risk exists at all levels, has always existed, and von Humboldt put it very clearly, plus lots of other people much before, but we haven't wished to look at the systemic part of risk, only at the direct impact on assets, etc. So, so I'll leave it there and pass it over to somebody else.
Mark, would you like to come in?
Yeah, sure. Maybe to say something about the concept of co-benefits and co-production. So for me, the sort of light, the warning light that flashes in the discussion of co-benefits is really to do with who it is that has defined the nature of the benefits. And it, just in my experience, it tends to be that these are received from above. So the co-benefits that I've seen, the argument for co-benefits tends to be that they support pre-existing national policy strategies and aims. Now, those could be fine for the urban poor and for ecological sustainability, but they might not be. And I see less questioning about the appropriateness of lines of development where co-benefits are revealed in the excitement to reveal a co-benefit. And if one sets that against the tradition of co-production, which I receive again very personally as something which seeks to build knowledge across power asymmetries, so very often with the urban poor or marginal or local policy actors, that's challenging development very often, rather than seeking to accelerate the gains of perceived contemporary development. So there's nothing essentially, I think, in contradiction between co-benefits and co-production, but I think the way that they are presented does cause an opportunity for challenge. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you, Mark. John, would you like to answer in those questions, or I have some other questions I can ask you about, particularly on the book too.
Can I deal with Bruce Stanley's question, actually? Is that all right?
Yeah, that I was going to ask you. Do you want to just
yeah, well, as best I can. I think it's a really good one. I mean, I wouldn't pretend that the handbook is comprehensive, because there's always an issue somewhere that you haven't foreseen or thought about. And the numerous chapters that we have in the book itself are reflective of the kind of submissions that we received. I hope the handbook isn't a static object in future. It would be nice if we could add to it by bringing in other issues, other ways of framing, other perspectives in future. How we do that within the, if you like, the publishing and institutional structures that we deal with, I don't know, but I certainly don't see this handbook as the end of a set of discussion about it. More, it is a starting point for broadening the debate, for deepening it and getting into some of the complexities that people have been talking about earlier. So yeah, I mean, I hope that sort of galvanizes some more lines of thinking, really.
Thanks. Thanks, John. I'm just wondering if everyone can see the questions there. So Bruce's question was, where does the issue of resilience to herbicide, state attack, NSA's takeover, shock and awe come into the handbook? I cannot see it in the chapter heading. Is this lacuna a problem, and how we actually frame and understand the risk to cities where their own or external regimes are the primary threat? So that's, thank you. There's a very nice question from Thomas in Zimbabwe, interested in working on resilience in informal settlements and looking for some literature. I'll answer you, Thomas, on that and give you some. A couple of questions that could be provocative for all three of our speakers. First of all, one question about resilience, urban development and resilience building in the context of conflict. I think we haven't talked a lot about conflict today, although Mark, a lot of those countries on your map are conflict countries. So if you could make some comments in relation to that for all of you. Also a question on the root causes. How do we look at the how do we go methodologically, how do we go about identifying root causes of risk given the complexity of urban environments? If it's so difficult to do, how can we systematically address risk? From Ronan McDonald. And another question from Taylor Hines. How can we in the DRR and urban planning fields move past the concept of resilience given its utilization by actors invested in maintaining the status quo? So a few provocative questions. So I'll give those to the three of you again, if you'd like to answer any of those, and then I probably have one more round of questions after. Mark.
I can jump in and offer a sort of very quick answer to Liza and Taylor around resilience in context of inequality, or what is it one seeks to make resilient. And for me, the catchphrase I have is that the resilience I want is not something that is stability seeking, not something that's trying to put anything into a state of solidity, whatever that might be, given changing social and environmental contexts. Even the progressive gains we have made, one could argue, are not enough or not in the right direction. So nothing is should we seek to make stable, but it's rather capacity seeking. So resilience for me is something that seeks to enable capacity, and that gives power to enable change rather than seeking stability. So I think that could be implied to contexts of, along the continuum, if you like, of social and economic tension, from informal settlements into conflict, post-conflict. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Mark. Alan, would you like to come in on any of those questions?
Yeah, Ronan's point, of course, is absolutely fundamental. And I think one of the major problems we've had in actually getting into risk reduction, risk control, is a sort of a shortfall on understanding risk as opposed to measuring risk. And I think this distinction has been made many times more recently. Understanding risk is that a little bit the co-production of knowledge, the understanding of competing interests, the understanding that risk comes from underlying root causes, which are expressed through what we call drivers of risk in more modern terminology, or other things. And what is clear is that our ability to get on top of something is very much related to our ability to understand its origins and the social actors involved, and therefore introduce the accountability principle. And I think one of the major problems with even conventional risk, let alone systemic risk, is the assignation of responsibility or accountability in some concrete way. Methodologies, I participated in the development of this foreign methodology along with Tony Oliver Smith and Ian Burton, etc., and Irasema, amongst efforts to try and provide methodological bases for deepening into what are the processes at an urban level, which are, as is said, highly complex. The problem is, if we don't get there and we don't have a way of getting on top of it, then what we're faced with is continuing growth of risk, as has happened and been illustrated by most databases over the last 10, 15, 20, if not more years.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Alan. Yeah, I think this is a very important point. John, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, on the root causes of risk and the complexity. Yeah, I mean, I'll follow Alan on that. It's incredibly difficult to do. I think the starting point is clearly to start having conversations about it, and I think we often don't. So that's my answer to that one. The Taylor's question about the utilization of resilience by actors invested in maintaining the status quo. Well, it's always been like that. Look at the way in which participation was hijacked, and community-based approaches have been hijacked by certain actors. I think there are lots of different kinds of resilience, I'm afraid. If you ask lots of different people, they will give you different perspectives. And I think it's important to, in a sense, show your colours and say, well, when I'm talking about resilience, I clearly mean this. And does that differ from what other people are doing? I think resilience can be a bit of a safe space for people who don't want to do their thinking. And we need to make it a slightly more dynamic and energetic and contested space.
Great. Yeah, I think that yeah, it has been hijacked, I think, and there's quite a lot of critique of the concept in relation to that. I've got a couple of other questions here that I think this one that from Stephen Forrest asks, I'm wondering what your thoughts are relating to how issues such as racism, sexism, and ageism are treated or perhaps ignored within resilience discussions. In what way can do resilience approaches or ideas interact with these important issues? And are any of these issues related in the handbook? And Emily Wilkinson asks, is migration a risk to cities? Just as we have, it's probably our last round, so I'll say we have one more question here. Do you see, from Khalid Ahmed, who's actually one of my PhD students at DPU, do you see the urban resilience taking part through the conventional development process when it comes to the provision of basic services, especially in the global south? Are there any foreseen significant roles by the poor communities to build their own resilience in the absence or lack of local government capacity and resources? He's doing research in Sudan. Is migration a risk to cities? Would anyone like to answer that or any of those other questions? Alan, please.
Yeah, maybe. Hello, Emily. Yeah, well, if one goes back to things, then migration was the source of urban growth originally. Consequently, a risk factor per se, it cannot be, although it can be behind risk. New migration patterns today are more related to rearrangement between cities with this process of more rapid growth of small and medium scale cities projected to the future. And so what is in play is the way migrants, and here we can link this to the other question about age, racism, ethnicity, sexism, etc., plays out in the urban environment. So the migrant as such is a potential for growth, a potential for advance, but to the extent that the whole structure of society and the decision-making processes work out in favor of what we're seeing with COVID migration, with Venezuelan migration to Latin American countries, etc., is that migration is a source of risk in the sense that the environment in which people are inserted creates that risk milieu, but beyond that. And then the other one, the one on the status quo one, which is a question we will be asking forever, the way in which concepts are in fact used, manipulated. We're now discussing systemic risk, and if you look at systemic risk, what is it being used to majorly for major world crises? But systemic risk exists at a local level, exists at a national level, has always existed. We've always talked about it in disaster studies, but it's always got waylaid in favor of something else. And so, yeah, we have to be constantly on our feet, no, sorry, on our toes, sorry. Speaking English at times is extremely difficult. I can't get the words, etc. So there are a lot of questions, there are a lot of good questions.
Thank you. Does anyone want to take actually John's, I think, answered the question in writing. I'm not sure what he said about looking at ageism and sexism and those issues in resilience. I mean, I think this is really, well, it talks about the need for looking at intersectional, looking at understanding things, you know, from different people's different perspectives. Yeah, John, I see you're ready to say something there.
I mean, the book has a chapter, one of the chapters deals with racism and one of them deals with gender issues. But if we'd received more, or we could probably have published more. It wasn't that we made a decision to have so many chapters on particular subjects. We took what came in and then saw how we could package it and present it. So there's much more to be said about that, and it is. I mean, coming back to the resilience issue as well, it's a bit disconcerting that those kind of issues aren't being talked about more sort of upfront in resilience discourse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And certainly, I think the COVID crisis has brought those to the fore about how different people, especially older people, are affected. Women are affected. Yeah. So we have one more comment coming from Margaret Arnold in response. She says, we spend a great deal of time and effort calculating climate co-benefits and development investments. The speakers talked about adaptation and mitigation co-benefits. I find myself now talking about social co-benefits of climate investments and COVID recovery in an attempt to get social dimensions more attention and investment. Is any of this helpful, or is it just adding to the confusion? So we're just in our final moments here. So I wanted to give everyone just a few, if you wanted to make sort of a final statement about any of the questions or anything. And Julia might want to come in on this too. Alan?
No, just to applaud again the book and the number of topics that come up, applaud the questions, and say that, advance in anything is always plagued with the questions which have been made here and which will continue to be made, and that basically this is going to need a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, but more than that, it's going to need a lot of conviction and commitment to lay out on the ground what are the basics of changing things. And I've always been interested not in the complexity of things, but of the simplicity of things. And I think COVID has illustrated with great simplicity a whole series of, in commas, simple things that if they're not gotten on top of, the rest of it will continue to be waylaid in our search for more equality, more justice, more of the things which we as academics and people believe we should be fighting for. Thanks for the opportunity to talk.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks a lot. Mark, do you want to say anything?
Well, to echo Alan's thanks for the opportunity to engage with the book and the questions today, which have been really fun and important. Maybe a final response to Khalid, who asks us about the relationship between the organised urban poor and particularly under-capacitated local government. And for me, there's an opportunity space there as well. I've seen contexts, thinking of Nairobi in particular, where very organized informal settlements are able to engage with, not so capacitated city governments, almost at parity. And that can, in the right context, really allow for progressive responses to urban infrastructure questions, including resilience. So there are spaces. I think there's a lot of goodwill, often from local governments, that we might cast in some way as barriers to progressive change. So I'll end on that point. And thanks very much again for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. John, do you have any closing statements?
Well, only to say that this is neither the start of a discussion nor the end of a discussion. It's just a point within that discussion, which is going to continue for a very long time. I hope that, I'm not going to commit anyone or anything to any institution to taking the sort of handbook further, but I think it would be valuable if we could take some of the learning and the lessons and the examples that come out of the handbook and if you like, repackage them, retranslate them, relocate them in other kinds of discourse, not just sort of our academic urban resilience circles.
Yeah, and Julia.
Thank you so much to, I think, all the speakers and everyone for asking such great questions. I think Alan and I met for the first time in Latin America on the anniversary of La Red, and it was called a themed and inconclusive encounter in a positive sense. And I got, just to echo John's words, I think that was what this short event here was as well. I'm going to put into the chat the link to the next Dialogues in Development at the DPU. Which is going to be hosted by Professor Chaim Jacobi on the theme of teaching Southern architecture and urbanism within a changing Western higher education context. And it's going to be on the 4th February. So I really hope we're going to see you there again. Thanks again for joining and for your contributions, and see you soon.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much to all our speakers and to Julia and our technical helpers, David and Alex. And just incredible to see all these colleagues from all over the world here, many whom some I know in person, some who I only know by name, but being here and part of the question. So thank you all very much. Hope this has given you some food for thought and also some welcome interaction during these strange times. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.